Usually when we think about the law, we picture something incredibly solid,
Oh, for sure.
like a massive courthouse with those giant marble columns or a thick, heavy book sitting on a judge's desk. It just feels prominent. It feels like a
Yeah.
wall that's just always been there telling us exactly what we can and cannot do.
Right. It projects this aura of absolute inevitability. You see a speed limit sign or you sign a contract, and you don't usually stop to ask where the authority for that specific rule actually came from.
Exactly.
You just accept the architecture of the rules around you. It's just the way things are.
But what if you were to walk up to that massive marble wall and realize it's, completely hollow?
Oh, yeah.
Or worse, what if you realize that the way that wall was built, like the actual process of how those rules were formed, is the single thing that determines whether you live in a free society or a dictatorship?
Yeah, that is a huge shift in perspective.
It really is. And our mission today is to figure out where the rules that govern your life actually come from. And I promise you, by the end of this deep dive, you won't just understand legal theory. You are going to look at every single news story about the government, the courts, and your own personal freedoms in a completely different light.
It fundamentally changes your perspective on everything. I mean, from a simple parking ticket all the way up to a massive Supreme Court ruling.
Seriously. So today we are pulling our insights from an excerpt titled Judicial Supremacy from the book The Legal Philosophy of the Common Law by Young King.
And it is quite a journey. It takes us all the way from ancient Athens to the desk of Napoleon Bonaparte, basically tackling one massive question, which is how do we prevent power from destroying liberty?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand the modern courts, we kind of have to look at the ancient blueprints of power.
Right. We have to go way back.
Yeah, back to 594 BC. The source introduces us to an ancient Athenian lawgiver named Solon. And Solon was, he was an intellectual heavyweight.
Oh, absolutely. Even Plato was a fan.
Right. Plato actually remarked that if Solon had stuck to writing poetry, his achievements might have rivaled Homer.
Which is high praise coming from Plato.
Seriously. But Solon didn't stick to poetry. He became the chief magistrate of Athens and pulled off this massive economic reform. Like, at the time, if you couldn't pay your debts, you could legally pledge your own body as collateral.
Which is terrifying to think about today.
Yeah, you could be forced into slavery just to pay off a loan. And Solon just abolished that entirely. But according to the text, his most lasting contribution wasn't economic at all. It was structural.
Yeah, because Solon articulated the principle of the mixed constitution. And this is really the foundational idea of a system built on restraint and balance.
Right, the idea that you don't just hand someone all the power.
Exactly. You don't just give one person a crown and absolute authority. You mix the power. You divide it up so that different parts of the government essentially push back against each other.
And that structural change is what laid the groundwork for centuries of political thought, right? Which eventually brings us to the 18th century French philosopher Montesquieu.
Right. The guy who formalized what we now call the separation of powers.
Yeah, exactly. He put it in 3 neat buckets: legislative, executive, and judicial.
Yeah.
But Young Kang makes a crucial distinction here about the actual nature of these powers, which, it completely reframes how we should view the government.
It really does, because when you look at the legislative and the executive powers, so making the laws and enforcing the laws, Young Kang describes those as active and assertive.
Right.
They impose their will from the top down, and they are backed by the coercive force of the state. I mean, they have the weapons, they have the prisons.
Right. Active power is fundamentally about force, or at least, the threat of force to achieve a governing objective.
Exactly. But adjudication, the judicial power, is categorized entirely differently. It is a passive power. Yeah. Think about it. A judge doesn't go out into the street looking for people to rule over. The judiciary just waits for disputes to be brought to it. It resolves conflicts based on rational deliberation rather than brute strength.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the key difference is that judicial authority relies on the recognition and assent of the litigants and impartial observers. It requires people to actually agree that the process is fair.
I was trying to visualize this mechanical difference earlier. If the government is a car, the legislative and executive branches are the engine and the gas pedal, right? Like, they provide the energy, they force it forward.
I like that analogy.
Thanks. And the judicial branch is the brakes. It's passive. You only use it to stop a collision or to keep the car from flying off a cliff. But I have to challenge this setup for a second.
Okay, let's hear it.
Isn't a passive power inherently kind of useless against an active one? I mean, if the executive branch has the actual physical force, the military, the police, how can the brakes actually control the engine? If push comes to shove, the engine just overpowers the brakes.
Right. That is the big question. But unlike a real car, judicial brakes aren't mechanical. They are psychological.
Psychological, what do you mean?
They only stop the engine of government if the society respects the judge's foot on the pedal. That is the exact vulnerability that makes the whole design so precarious. The brakes only work because the citizens collectively agree that an impartial ruling holds more weight than raw executive power.
Wow. Okay, so it relies entirely on buy-in from the public.
Exactly. And this leads directly into why we need those psychological brakes to be so heavily reinforced in the culture. It's to protect liberty from mutating into either total anarchy or total fear.
Right, which was a huge theme for Montesquieu. He argued in his masterpiece, The Spirit of Laws, that the highest achievement of any nation's laws is the expansion of individual liberty.
Yeah, and that's counterintuitive for a lot of people today. People often assume law and liberty are engaged in this zero-sum game. The idea is that every new law deducts 1 unit of freedom from your life.
Like it's a trade-off.
Exactly, but Montesquieu views that as a total false dichotomy. Without law, you don't get freedom. You get anarchic violence. You get a world where the strongest person simply takes whatever they want.
So the law creates the boundaries where true liberty can actually be safe.
Spot on. But on the flip side, if you have law without liberty, then the law just becomes an instrument of arbitrariness and fear.
And it's interesting because Montesquieu was actively pushing back against the Hobbesian view here.
Right.
Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan, which was all about absolute submission through fear.
Right. Hobbes wanted a strong man to just keep everyone in line.
Yeah, and Montesquieu rejected that. But he also found John Locke's almost purely property-focused social contract to be a bit too narrow. So he had to find a new psychological anchor for the law. And for him, that anchor was the active expansion of individual liberty.
And to map out how these different anchors actually function in the real world, Montesquieu broke down the political order into 3 distinct forms, and each form is sustained by a very specific human emotion.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have the republic, which is sustained by civic virtue, meaning the people have to actually care about the common good for a republic to survive.
Makes sense.
Second, you have the monarchy, which is sustained by honor, specifically the honor of the sovereign and the nobility. And third, you have despotism, which is sustained entirely by the fear of the subjects.
Now, it's crucial to note here, and I want to be very clear about this for our listeners, we are just mapping out Young Kang's specific framework and the examples he provides in the text. We aren't taking a side or making any political endorsements here.
Absolutely. We are strictly maintaining an impartial view and just reporting what the author claims in the source material.
Right. So with that said, the author connects this framework to a rather contentious claim by the historian Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee observed that all the suffering of a nation is a result of the choices made by its own people.
Which is a very heavy statement.
It's very heavy. And the text uses this to point directly at the former Soviet Union and today countries like China, North Korea, Iran, and even what the author calls certain disordered states within the United States. The argument in the book is that these are outcomes of the choices made by their peoples to tolerate fear rather than demand virtue.
This raises an important question.
Which is?
Well, if a society's implicit choices dictate whether they live in a free republic sustained by virtue or a despotic regime sustained by fear, how are the actual day-to-day rules of that society formulated? Do leaders sit down and painstakingly draft them from scratch? Or is there another mechanism at play?
Yeah, like if a society is doomed to fail when it relies purely on fear, how do we actually build rules that rely on mutual consent?
Exactly. And that brings us to the economic philosopher Friedrich Hayek and his concept of spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order. I love that phrase.
It's a great concept. Hayek draws a massive line in the sand between 2 different types of rules: external rules and internal rules. External rules are generated by governing and administration. They are imposed from the outside, top down.
Like a decree from a king.
Right. But internal rules are generated by adjudication. They emerge naturally from resolving disputes bottom up.
And the quintessential example of this spontaneous order is the English common law tradition, right? Because in the source, it emphasizes that in common law, law isn't created, it is discovered.
Yes, that distinction is everything.
I really want to linger on that word for a second. Discovered. When a judge looks at a dispute, let's say Two modern tech companies fighting over a data scraping issue that didn't even exist 10 years ago. The judge isn't inventing a new rule out of thin air.
Right, they aren't just making it up.
Exactly. They are looking at precedent, they're digging into tradition, and they are discovering the most rational, fair principle that already implicitly exists within our broader societal values regarding, property and fairness. It's an incremental process, trial and error, case by case.
It is entirely organic. And Hayek points out that Roman law during the Republican period functioned this exact same way, as did the law merchant, which were the rules developed by traders across Europe over centuries.
Oh, right. The trade rules.
Yeah, those trade rules weren't handed down by a king or an emperor. They evolved out of sheer practicality. If a rule facilitated fair trade, it survived. If it caused friction, it was discarded.
Okay, I'm going to play the rationalist for a second here.
Go for it.
Because looking at common law, it seems wildly inefficient, waiting like 200 years for precedent to form just so we know how to handle a contract dispute. That seems like a terrible way to run a modern, fast-paced society. Wouldn't it be far safer and honestly infinitely more efficient to gather a room full of brilliant experts, have them think through every possible scenario, and just write down all the optimal rules in advance?
You are definitely not the first person to think that. That is the exact trap of the constructivist approach.
A trap.
Yes, because it appeals perfectly to our modern desire for efficiency and clean design. But Hayek argued fiercely against this kind of hubris. The fundamental problem is a knowledge deficit.
Meaning we just aren't smart enough.
Basically, yeah. No single individual, no committee of experts, and no sovereign authority possesses enough collective knowledge or foresight to invent universally valid laws from scratch. Society is just too complex.
Right, there are too many variables.
Exactly. When a sovereign tries to anticipate every human interaction and write a rule for it, they inevitably fail to capture the nuance of real life. And worse, to enforce that rigid artificial design, they have to centralize immense power. They turn the law from a fluid tool of justice into a rigid weapon for comprehensive societal control.
Wow. And to see what happens when leaders decide they actually do have enough knowledge to pre-write reality, we just have to look at the massive historical shift toward codification, the birth of civil law.
Yeah, this is the exact opposite of discovering law. This is manufacturing it.
And it really gained momentum with the Romans. In 438 AD, the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II promulgated the first official European code. But the architectural shift in power really happened under Justinian I.
Justinian realized that to truly consolidate imperial power, you have to monopolize the legal reality. He didn't just compile his own decrees, he completely overhauled how law was learned and referenced.
He went after the foundation itself.
He really did. The Justinian Code had four main parts. There was the Codex Justinianus, which were the imperial constitutions. Then the Institutions, which was an introductory textbook for students. The Digesta, or Pandectae, which compiled opinions of jurists. And finally, the Novellae, which were new laws.
I mean, that is the ultimate power move. Shifting from a system where local magistrates resolve disputes based on community norms to a system where your very textbook in law school is mandated by the emperor. The state basically captures the source code of reality.
It completely altered the power dynamic. The law was no longer a shared inheritance that the emperor was subject to. It became a product that the emperor manufactured and distributed.
But the person who perfected this art of the written code, taking it to an almost pathological level, was Napoleon Bonaparte.
Oh, Napoleon was obsessed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You're talking about the 1804 Napoleonic Code. Napoleon didn't just order a committee to draft this and then go off to conquer Europe. He personally attended more than 90 of the 100-plus drafting meetings.
That is wild.
It is. That is not just governance. That is an absolute obsession with micromanaging human interaction. The code had 3 books, 35 chapters, and exactly 2,281 articles covering everything from property rights to inheritance to marital debts. He essentially attempted to write a user manual for human existence.
Just consider the psychological difference between those two systems. In a common law system, a judge is looking at 2 specific individuals in a specific dispute and trying to find a fair resolution just for them.
Right.
But Napoleon was sitting in a room trying to pre-write the rules for millions of future unseen interactions involving people who hadn't even been born yet.
Which sounds completely impossible.
But because it was so systematically rationalized, it was highly exportable. The Napoleonic Code became the model for Louisiana, Denmark, Greece, Germany, Spain, Brazil. It essentially established the absolute monopoly of the modern state over legislation.
So we've arrived at this huge fork in the road for human civilization. Two diverging paths. On one side, the messy, organic, discovered common law. On the other side, the neat, organized, state-mandated civil code. Why does Young Kang, channeling Hayek, argue that one of these paths leads to freedom and the other leads to control? Because, I mean, on the surface, they both just result in rules that citizens have to follow, right?
True, but the distinction lies in the concept of instrumentalism.
Instrumentalism.
Yes, when a state monopolizes lawmaking, it rarely makes rules solely to keep the peace or ensure fairness. It makes rules to achieve its own organizational policies. The law becomes a lever to shape society into whatever the sovereign wants it to be at that particular moment.
So the individual doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly. Governance through this kind of centralized public law inevitably results in comprehensive control over each citizen, subordinating the individual's goals to the state's purposes. Written law, when completely monopolized by the active branches of government, degenerates into a coercive command.
And this brings us to the ultimate thesis of the source material, judicial supremacy. Because if the sovereign is the one writing the rules, executing the rules, and dictating how the courts apply those rules, you might have a society with laws, but you absolutely do not have the rule of law.
Precisely.
True constitutionalism-like, the kind that actually protects your freedom against the engine of the state, requires rulemaking to be heavily anchored in the judiciary.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a judge in a true common law system isn't functioning as an enforcer of state policy. They are functioning as an arbiter of accumulated human reason.
Which goes back to that psychological brake pedal we talked about earlier.
Yes, people obey those judicial decisions not because a police officer is standing behind the judge with a weapon, but because the decisions command the assent of reasonable observers. The judicial process itself, that passive power, is what restricts and disciplines governing power.
It's the balance.
The coercive violence of governance must be restrained by the nonviolent, rational process of adjudication. For Hayek, returning to the tradition of common law isn't just, an academic preference for how we handle contracts. It is the fundamental prerequisite for maintaining a free society.
So what does this all mean? We started this journey in ancient Athens, watching Solon build the first mixed constitution to constrain power.
We explored Montesquieu's warning that without divided power, liberty inevitably rots into the fear of despotism.
And we saw the fundamental clash between law that is discovered organically from the ground up through human interaction and law that is dictated from the top down by an emperor micromanaging reality with over 2,000 written articles.
It really is a fascinating contrast.
It means that the laws governing your daily life, your property, your contracts, your personal freedom, they aren't just arbitrary rules. They are the front line of a very old war. They are either a shield constructed from centuries of inherited wisdom, or they are a sword wielded by the state to control its citizens.
It serves as a stark reminder that the architecture of our legal system is inherently fragile, and it relies entirely on our constant active assent to function properly.
Yeah. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder on your own. If Hayek and the author are right, that true organic law is discovered through spontaneous human interaction and trial and error, think about the internet.
Oh, that's a great point.
Right. Because we are constantly interacting in these massive digital spaces right now, largely without a formal global sovereign dictating every single action. What unwritten rules of digital life are we, as a global society, discovering right now through our disputes and resolutions? What spontaneous order is forming online that might just evolve into the common law of tomorrow?
It's a phenomenal space to watch the evolution of internal rules happen in real time. Truly unprecedented.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away seeing the invisible rules around you just a little bit clearer. Until next time.